If you were kidnapped and put into a death game with 4 brutal tests that you had to survive, what would you do? He may be dead, but Jigsaw still has a few tricks left up his sleeve, and now he's going after one of his most cold-blooded enemies yet. This time, it's personal, so we're here to break down the mistakes made, what you should do, and how to beat the 4 chambers of death in Saw 6. This insurance executive is about to find out what it's like to have your life in someone else's hands. The first game begins as this woman Simone wakes up with a horrifying device strapped to her head. Terrified, her first instinct is to get to her feet, but that was her biggest mistake. As she stands up, she pulls out a wire from the back of her helmet that activates her half of the trap. Locked in a cell on the other side of the room is her coworker, Eddie, and she tries warning him not to move, but immediately he goes into a total panic and ends up activating his side too. Now that both players are awake, a message from Jigsaw begins to explain the rules of the game. It turns out that Eddie and Simone here are predatory lenders and have been scamming people out of their hard-earned money through a repossession scheme. On the table behind each of them are 2 knives, and they'll be given only 1 minute to drop as much of their own flesh as they can onto a scale. When the timer runs out, whoever's given the most will to survive, and the loser's helmet will activate, killing them by piercing their temples with 2 large screws. Just like before, Eddie instantly freaks out, and he's ready to do whatever it takes to survive. Unfortunately for Simone, he's literally got more meat on his bones, so he starts cutting out big chunks of his belly and throwing them into the chute, tipping the scale to his side before Simone has made up her mind. With time running out, she decides that her only option is to sacrifice an entire half of her arm if she wants to live. It's brutal, but at the last second, she's able to cut all the way through her arm and throw it onto the scale, beating Eddie by just a small difference. As the timer runs out, the screws on Eddie's helmet squeeze through the sides of his head to kill him, but Simone survives the test. Okay, I've heard of things costing an arm and a leg, but this is just ridiculous. Simone here may have won the game and escaped with her life, but her victory came at a high price, so it's probably worth assessing the situation from an outsider's perspective. Now, as is often the case with Jigsaw's traps, the real danger here didn't start until they'd both unintentionally activated the game. In this case, the trap didn't start until both Eddie and Simone had gotten out of the chairs and pulled the pins from the back of their helmets. This means that if Simone had only been more cautious before standing up, then she may have been able to feel the wire on the back of her head and use the knife from the table behind her to carefully work away at it. With any luck, she might have actually severed the wire without pulling the pin, and then she'd be able to move around freely without ever activating the trap in the first place. Even after Simone stood up, there was still a chance that Eddie here could have done the same thing on his side, but he made a deadly mistake by immediately going into fight or flight mode instead of listening to her warning. With that being said, once the game was officially started, each of them only had a limited time to figure out how they were going to survive. We heard Jigsaw's explanation for what they were supposed to do, but nobody wants to start cutting off their own body parts if they can help it. So I'd want to save that option for my last resort. You're gonna have to be careful though, because wasting too much time just gives your opponent an opportunity to get ahead. Let's start by taking a look at this helmet here, since that's what's actually going to kill you when the timer runs out. Since it's not hooked up to anything else in the room, this means that it must have been some sort of built-in power supply, and it could be possible to use the knife to deactivate the mechanism, either by damaging the gears or possibly by cutting through any of those several exposed wires. Without power, the screws won't be able to turn, and then you'd have plenty of time to focus on getting out of there. It's worth a shot, but chances are that damaging the helmet won't work out. So I might also try using any object that I can find in the room to give myself an advantage. For example, after Simone here had already cut her arm off, we see that there's a barrel on a cart tucked around the corner. If you could fit it through the fence, then it could be possible to use the pole that's attached to the cart to press down on the scale with your body weight and win the game without needing to sacrifice a limb. Alternatively, if that barrel happens to be full of liquid, then you could try puncturing it with a knife and using the rubber hose to drain the barrel out onto the scale, using the liquid to weigh your side down. If all else fails, then I hate to say it, but it looks like sacrificing a body part is going to be the only choice. Ideally, you wouldn't want to have to lose an arm, but it was pretty much the only way that Simone here was going to beat out Eddie after he'd already gotten such a big head start. And it might have actually been the better of their two strategies. Besides the knives, the only other item that they were provided with was a tourniquet, allowing them to manage their blood loss if they cut off a limb. Eddie's strategy might have seemed less destructive, but with no way to control his blood loss, he could die in as quickly as 5 minutes from those injuries, even if he had managed to win the game. Simone, on the other hand, may have removed a more vital body part, but this way, she could tie off the artery and slow the bleeding down long enough for her to get help. As far as technique goes, Simone here applied the tourniquet pretty much perfectly, keeping it high and tight above the wound near her armpit. This should keep her alive long enough to get to the emergency room once she finds a way out of the test chamber. This might sound crazy, but now that the test is over, Simone should try to get her arm back if she can, since it might be possible to surgically reattach it if she gets medical attention within a few hours. With this plan in mind, using the cleaver from the very beginning would have been a better choice because of the fact that it makes a cleaner cut, and thereby makes it easier for doctors to replant the arm. But escaping with your life and one arm still attached is much better than the alternative, if that's what it takes to survive. Veteran detective Mark Hoffman arrives at the crime scene of the latest test, where he's met by Special Agent Erickson of the FBI, as well as Agent Perez, who was believed to have been killed by a jigsaw trap several days before, but is actually still alive. To everyone's surprise, they've found fingerprints at the scene belonging to their missing colleague, Agent Strom. They want to bring Hoffman in on the investigation, but what they don't know is that Strom is actually dead. Hoffman here is the secret jigsaw accomplice that they've been looking for, and he killed Strom in a convoluted scheme to frame him for the crimes. At every crime scene, Jigsaw would cut a small puzzle piece out of the victim's body, but in this case, something is different. The forensic investigator noticed that the cuts on Eddie's skin indicate that the blade that was used had a serrated edge. Every other victim was cut with a surgeon's scalpel except for one, the body of Seth Baxter, who murdered Hoffman's sister and was actually his first victim before he became Jigsaw's accomplice. They've decided to investigate the Baxter tape to see if they can unscramble the recording and match it to Strom's voice. If this turns out to be true, then they'll finally have enough evidence to confirm Strom's guilt. But Hoffman can sense that his colleagues are getting closer to the truth with every turn. Next up on the chopping block is William Easton, an executive at an insurance company who's been making money by finding ways to revoke people's coverage when they actually need it the most. While he's burning the midnight oil in preparation for a big legal battle, he sees the silhouette of someone armed with a handgun approaching through the frosted glass window. Fearing for his life, William grabs his own weapon from out of his desk and quietly sneaks around behind the person as they enter. In the heat of the moment, he fires a single shot into the intruder's chest, only to realize that it was just the building security guard. As he tries to get the man some medical attention, Hoffman jumps up from behind him wearing a pig mask, knocking William out with a needle full of sedatives before dragging him off for his test. When he wakes up, William finds that he's been placed inside of a terrifying contraption, with his body stuck inside of a giant vise and an oxygen mask strapped over his face. Moments later, a message from Jigsaw begins to play, explaining that over the next 60 minutes, he's going to be put through a series of 4 tests all centered around his formula for deciding who should receive medical coverage. He has 4 explosive shackles attached to each of his limbs, and if he should fail, then the explosions will detonate, blowing off his hands and feet. To make matters even worse, Jigsaw has also captured his family, and he'll need to reach the end of the maze if he ever wants to see them again. Across the room, William sees that his janitor, Hank, is also strapped to an identical device. The man is a smoker who hasn't kicked the habit, even though he suffers from high blood pressure and heart disease, showing a lack of respect for his own life. With every breath they take, the vice will clamp tighter around their chest until they've finally been crushed to death. And the only way for either of them to survive is to outlast the other. Okay, I thought this was supposed to be a challenge, but it looks like Jigsaw set up Slick Willy here for an easy win on this one. Instead of the usual blood and guts, all that he needs to do is hold his breath for longer than the other guy, and he has several factors working to his advantage. He might be a world-class janitor, but he's no world-class athlete as far as I can tell. As a matter of fact, Hank here is a habitual smoker, which means that he's naturally going to have decreased lung capacity and a higher heart rate, giving him a clear leg up in the contest. Inside your lungs, you have about 500 million small air sacs called alveoli. These air sacs collect oxygen when you breathe in and release carbon dioxide when you breathe out. Smoking damages the tissue in these air sacs by killing the cells over time. And once the damage is done, there's no way to fix it, because unlike many areas of the body, lung tissue doesn't grow back. The worse that the damage becomes, the harder that it is for the person to fully expand their lungs, which leads to a decrease in lung capacity. Even if Hank here wasn't a smoker, he's still about 10 years older than William. At that age, lung capacity naturally decreases as well, and that's why my money's on William to win this with ease. The average person can hold their breath for about 30 seconds to just under 2 minutes. It'll seem easy at first, but after that 30-second mark, you'll probably start to feel pain in your lungs. After 2 minutes, your body will start trying to force you to take a breath, and after 6 minutes, if you can make it that long, you'll pass out as your brain takes over and essentially forces you to do a hard reset so that you'll begin breathing naturally again. Most people, including me until I was researching this video, think that the reason why you can't hold your breath any longer is because you're running out of oxygen, but this actually isn't true. The problem is that you haven't been exhaling carbon dioxide, and a dangerous amount is building up in your bloodstream. Once the levels within your body are too high, your nervous system steps in, forcing you to exhale, even if you're about to be crushed by a jigsaw trap. Although there are techniques to train for a better lung capacity, unfortunately, it looks like it's a bit too late for that, but William can still give himself even more of an advantage if he's careful. His best bet is going to be to take one more deep breath, and after that, it's all about willpower. He needs to relax his body, move as little as possible, and try to stay calm in order to keep as low of a heart rate as possible. Whatever that he has to do to avoid taking another deep breath for as long as he possibly can. This should be a layup for William here, but even if he makes it through, he's still got 3 tests to go, and the next ones won't be so easy. Now the first game begins, and both men start holding their breath for as long as they possibly can until they can't hold out anymore. They each take a breath, and the device slowly closes in around them, but there's still a long way to go. Despite his natural advantages, William here actually begins to lose. But as Hank gets more and more injured, he starts to panic, gasping for air until the vice squeezes him so tight that it completely fractures his ribcage, crushing him to death. With that, William is released, having survived his first test. As the lights in the chamber turn on, William finds a key that releases one of his explosive shackles and begins following a trail of red arrows painted on the wall towards his next test, with just over 55 minutes left on the timer. Meanwhile, this woman Tara and her son Brent wake up in a cage that's somewhere else in the building. The only other thing that's in there with them is a giant container full of hydrofluoric acid, and it seems to be connected to the chamber's fire sprinkler system. On the wall next to the container is a switch that offers them a simple choice: live or die. But they're too afraid to take action yet, having no idea what any of this could even mean. In fact, they're not the only ones who've been caged up. This reporter Pamela here is also somehow connected to the game that's taking place, and she's trapped in an identical chamber as well. Okay, this is not a situation that you want to be in. These people are trapped with less than 1 hour left on the countdown, and they don't know what happens when time runs out, but odds are that it isn't going to be good. They need to get out of there as quickly as possible, and the good news is that the key to their escape is right there in the cage with them, if only they can figure out a way to safely use it. If they can get some of that acid onto the cage, then they should be able to create a big enough hole to crawl through. Later, Tara here is going to suggest this, but immediately gives up when her son says that it's just too dangerous. And while I'll agree with him that it's going to be risky, it also seems like their best and only shot at getting out of there to me. So I'd probably spend the next hour trying to come up with a way to do it. Now, the reason why they need to be so careful is because hydrofluoric acid is not only highly corrosive, but also extremely poisonous. Symptoms of exposure to hydrofluoric acid include irritation to the eyes, nose, and throat, as well as severe burns, and coming into contact with even a small amount can quickly turn fatal. So, needless to say, scooping some of it up into your hands isn't going to work. Hydrofluoric acid can eat through many types of material, including human flesh. But one of the few materials that's resistant to the compound is rubber. So, if either of them were wearing rubber-soled shoes, then they could try carefully collecting some of the acid into a shoe from the dripping pipe, and then use it to create a hole in the cage that's large enough for them to escape. It's going to be incredibly dangerous, and there are no guarantees that it'll work, but as long as they're extremely careful, the only thing that they'll risk losing are their shoes, so it's definitely worth a try. Further down the hall, William comes to an area that was once an aquarium and sees that one of the tanks has 2 handles with the message, "Take them." At first, he tries to ignore it and move on, but the shackle on his wrist starts to blink as if it's about to explode, forcing him to turn back. As he grabs hold of the handles, the machine spins to life, and Jigsaw's puppet comes swinging towards him across the chamber to explain the rules of the game. On the other side of the tank, 2 of William's employees are standing on elevated platforms with barbed wire wrapped around their necks. To his right is Alan, a young, healthy file clerk with no close family. And on his left is Addie, a middle-aged woman with a complicated medical history, but also a family who will suffer greatly from her loss. Only one of them can survive, and it's up to William to make the choice. The test begins, and the 2 chains quickly start pulling William's arms apart. Panicking, he shouts to the air about how he's not willing to make the choice, but with every precious second that he hesitates, the chains only pull further and further away, until finally he begins to lose his grip. At the last second, William chooses to save Addie, grabbing onto her side of the chain with both hands. Suddenly, Alan falls from his platform and swings across the chamber, his lifeless body crashing into the glass on the other side. Addie thanks William for saving her life, but she's forced to find her own way out while he presses onward. Before leaving the room, he finds another key to one of his shackles, and William moves deeper into the maze, knowing that he's only halfway through, with just under 40 minutes left on the timer. Okay, this was brutal. William here was forced to choose between the lives of 2 relatively innocent employees, and given no possible way to save them both. The decision wasn't easy either, because neither of the 2 workers had an obvious reason why William should morally choose to save them over the other. On the one hand, practically nobody would notice that Alan was dead, while Addie here had a family that would miss her very much, and could even come after William later down the line if they somehow found out that he was involved in her death. On the other, it might seem harsh to say this, but Addie had already lived a pretty full life, while Alan still had a lot of life left ahead of him. No matter how you looked at it, the choice was going to have severe consequences either way. And it's not like either one of them was a truly terrible person who deserved what was coming to them like their boss here. Once the trap was started, there was no way for William to save them both. The only thing that he could have done differently was to carefully check the trap out before he restarted it, and possibly never start the game in the first place. But this would have put his own life at risk if he wasn't able to move on. With all that being said, the conclusion here is that William and one of the employees were pretty much screwed from the minute that this test started, and the only possible solution that I can think of is this. Once Alan's hands were released, instead of standing there angrily glaring at William, he could have quickly reached up and grabbed onto the barbed wire to stop himself from choking. Then he could have stuck his feet out in front of him as he swung towards the glass on the other side, and with any luck, possibly have broken straight through. If he was able to hold on for long enough, then he might have survived being pulled up to wherever it was that the machine took him, but there's really no way to be sure. As for William, once the game had already started, there wasn't a lot that he could do besides possibly channel his inner Liver King and go full primal mode to overpower the machine with nothing but his raw strength. But let's be honest, that wasn't going to work out. If he wanted to make it fair, maybe he could have just told the two of them to pick a number between 1 and 10, and whoever guesses it right or gets the closest gets to live. It's definitely not the best solution, I know, but it works. At least with this game, William was never actually in harm's way himself, but this isn't the last time where he'll have to choose who lives or dies. And the next time, it's going to be unimaginably worse. On his way to the next chamber, William notices a message written on his arm reading "Final Decision." He knows that it's referring to a time when Jigsaw, who he knew as John Kramer, came to him desperately requesting coverage for an experimental gene therapy treatment that could have potentially cured the man's cancer. After listening to John plead his case, William responded that, considering his age and the stage of his cancer, it was already too late, telling him that they wouldn't be covering his treatment and blaming the decision on company policy. As he left his office, John promised William that one day he'd pay for his callous actions, and now it looks like that promise has finally come true. Entering the next chamber, William steps onto an elevated walkway above a boiler room, where he finds a tape player explaining the rules of the third test. Below him is his lawyer, Debbie, with a harpoon launcher strapped to her chest that's pointed straight at her head. She'll be given 90 seconds to cross through a death maze to the other side of the room. Otherwise, the trap will activate when the timer runs out, killing her. William can help her make it across, but the only way that she'll survive is if they both work together. As the test starts, Debbie here immediately begins to panic, but William finally gets her to calm down and tells her what she needs to do. After winding her way through the first test runs, she gets to a point where there are bursts of hot steam blocking her path, leaving her with no way forward. William realizes that he can pull a lever to let her pass through, but he'll be redirecting the steam directly onto himself as he does. Knowing that it's going to be incredibly painful, he gathers his courage, grabs onto the lever, and holds out for as long as he can. Debbie makes it almost all the way through, but he releases the lever before she's completely clear, severely burning her leg in the process. Still, a burnt leg is better than death, and Debbie keeps moving until she comes to another steam trap, this one lined with hot plates on the walls that will burn her even worse if she bumps into them. To let her through, William must pull another lever, sacrificing himself so that she can get to safety. It's working, but just when she's almost to the other side, William can't bear the pain any longer. He's forced to let go of the lever, causing Debbie to suffer more burns from the steam and the hot plates. Despite her injuries, Debbie finally makes it through to the end of the maze, but there's more to this test than William thought. By looking at pictures on the wall, she realizes that the key to set her free is actually hidden inside of William's chest. Before he can even react, the woman grabs a circular saw and rushes towards him, deciding to cut the key out herself so that she can survive. The test ends in an all-out brawl, with each of them fighting for their lives. But William manages to hold Debbie off for just long enough that the timer runs out. The trap activates and sends a spike flying straight up through Debbie's head, killing her instantly. With the game finished, the door out of the chamber opens, and William is on to his final test. But this one is going to be the most horrific of all. Okay, this time it was out of the frying pan and into the fire for old Willie here, and it looks like Jigsaw is literally turning up the heat. As usual, it's hard to think straight under these conditions, but our two contestants here were so busy panicking that they missed some easy opportunities to get through this clean. In order to get Debbie to the other side of the maze safely, William had to blow off some steam and put himself in harm's way to do it. Sudden exposure to hot steam can cause scalding, which usually leads to first or second degree burns, and it's definitely going to be painful, but not necessarily fatal. Prolonged exposure, however, can result in third-degree burns, which completely destroy the outer layers of skin and can even damage tissue all the way down to your bones. Third-degree burns also destroy the nerve endings in the affected area, so you won't actually feel a thing, but unlike lesser burns, these can be fatal without medical attention. All that is to say that for William and Debbie here to get through safely, the key was to minimize contact with the steam as much as possible. From William's side, he could have used an article of clothing like his shirt, balled it up, and jammed it inside of each of the pipes before pulling the lever. That way, he'd slow down how much steam was able to come through at once. He could have also tried simply turning the opening of the pipe away from him, or using anything in the room to his advantage. Up there on the walkway when he first entered the chamber, it seems like there was some kind of cart full of old hoses and tools. With a little creativity, he might have been able to loop one of these hoses around the lever on the pipe, and then pulled on it to release the steam without having to stand directly in front. For Debbie, I get why she'd be willing to take out her boss to survive now that she'd made it so close to the finish line, but clearly this was the wrong approach. Instead, she could have tried to use the saw to cut some of the tubes from her trap instead, hopefully disabling it with any luck. There was also a shovel in the room where she got the saw, which she could have tried to use to block the bolt, or she could have leaned up against one of the safety railings on the catwalk, placing the thickest part between the device and her head to possibly deflect the spike when it fired out. As much of a scumbag as he is, William here was even willing to try pulling the key out of his chest if she'd just given him a moment. But Debbie jumped the gun and turned it into a death match, and that was a huge mistake. It's time to move on to the final test, but before leaving, William should take the shovel and circular saw with him, because you never know when they might come in handy down the road. Meanwhile, Hoffman here has secretly been observing the test the whole time, but he's interrupted by a call from Agent Erickson. The other two agents have made an important breakthrough in the case and want him to come down to the office so that they can discuss something in person. When he gets there, Perez tells him that they've discovered something suspicious about Strom's fingerprints. The samples that they collected were contaminated with a particular type of freon that went out of production back in the 90s, and now they're trying to figure out if the substance was already at the crime scene or if Strom somehow brought it with him. Just then, Erickson receives a call from their technician. She's about to decrypt the Baxter tape, revealing whose voice is really on it, with Hoffman already knowing that he's one wrong move away from being caught. Back in the death maze, William arrives at the next chamber where the doorway is painted with a huge red spiral. Inside, he finds 6 of his most trusted employees chained to a spinning carousel, and they're all begging for his help. When the carousel stops, one unlucky employee at a time will be staring down the barrel of a loaded shotgun. To save them, he'll have to willingly reach into an incredibly painful trap and press a button that will stab a spike straight through his hand. It's brutal, and to add insult to injury, he can only choose to save 2 out of the 6. Okay, this is the most deranged trap yet. Just like the aquarium test, William's life isn't actually on the line, but he's being forced to make an impossible choice. In the past, he's had no problem choosing who lives and who dies when the responsibility was diluted through a comfortable barrier of paperwork. But here, with the results of his decisions playing out right in his face, how can he possibly pick just 2 out of the 6 to save and go on living with a clear conscience? The optimal solution is obviously to try and rescue them all, but time is running out from the moment that this game started, and every moment that he wastes figuring out how to save them will only bring them all that much closer to death. Now, the test only started when he entered the room through the main door, so by going back and checking out the main area around it, he might find the trigger mechanism and, with any luck, be able to deactivate it to stop the trap, but this most likely isn't going to work out. Instead, he could look for any junk inside of the room that might allow him to reach through the bars and sabotage the mechanism that fires the gun. Since this is a zoo, there must be a way for the animals and animal handlers to get in and out of the cage. If he can find the entrance and get inside, then it might be possible to either quickly set all of the victims free, or somehow stop the shotgun from working, either by manually unloading the shells or by sabotaging the device that pulls the trigger. If he'd kept the circular saw from earlier, this would make things even easier, because even if the entrance is locked, he could have tried to chop his way inside and then use the saw to disable the shotgun or free them from their restraints. Unfortunately, there's a good chance that saving all of them just isn't going to be an option, which will mean that his only choice is to play by the rules. In that case, he could try using a shoe or some trash from somewhere in the room to push the button and at least prevent his hand from getting impaled. If all else fails, and there's no way to rescue everyone, then he's going to have to decide who to save. The only ethical way to do this is to remember what he can about their personal lives and try to pick two people whose family depends on them the most, and whose death here would cause the most suffering to others. It's not going to be easy, and even after he's finished, William's still going to have one last challenge ahead of him that's going to be the most dangerous of all. The game begins, and the carousel stops on the first victim. Terrified, he pleads for William to spare his life, but William can't bring himself to do it, and the man is killed as the trap activates, leaving 5 more to go. The machine keeps spinning as the remaining victims aggressively argue their cases, throwing each other under the bus at any opportunity just for a chance to survive, until it finally comes to a stop on the second woman. This time, William reaches in and presses the button. Suddenly, a spike pierces straight through his hand, but the shotgun points towards the ceiling before firing. The woman has survived, but now he can only choose to save one more victim, and there are still 4 lives on the line. The machine keeps going until 2 more employees are dead, which leaves only 2 more of them to go. It's down to the last man and woman, and the 2 of them are at each other's throats, saying anything that they can to convince William why he should choose them over the other. Finally, the carousel stops on the woman, and William chooses to save her life, impaling his hand again in the process. With 2 victims saved, the last man's fate is sealed, and he's absolutely furious, knowing that he's going to die. As the machine comes to a stop, he curses William with his dying breaths, telling him that he's always been a scumbag before the shotgun blows him away. With the final test complete, William thinks that his game is finally over, but in classic Jigsaw fashion, he's about to realize that he's not safe just yet. Meanwhile, Hoffman, Erickson, and Perez arrive at the lab where their technician is about to decrypt the Baxter tape, uncovering the killer's real voice. For the first time, Perez expresses her suspicions that Strom was really innocent, saying that the facts of the case just don't add up. And the atmosphere in the room is tense as Hoffman realizes that the walls are closing in around him. That's when Erickson tells him that the DNA evidence from Strom's fingerprints show that he was already dead when they were placed at the latest crime scene, just as the technician reveals that the voice on the tape has been Hoffman's all along. They think that they have him right where they want him, but in the blink of an eye, Hoffman draws a knife from his pocket and slices open the side of Erickson's neck with one swift move. Before Perez can react, he throws a cup full of scalding hot coffee straight in her face and jams a screwdriver into a power strip, taking out the lights. Regaining her composure, Perez draws her pistol and immediately opens fire, but Hoffman grabs the technician and uses her as a meat shield. Closing the distance, he pins Perez to the wall and stabs her several times in the stomach before letting her body collapse to the floor. With the three of them down, Hoffman returns to his car where he grabs Strom's severed hand from a cooler in the trunk. Back inside, he plants Strom's fingerprints all over the crime scene, douses the bodies with gasoline, and strikes a match, burning the entire place to the ground. Okay, well, that didn't work out like they planned. They say that you should keep your friends close and your enemies closer, but it looks like this time, that just backfired pretty tremendously for our two FBI agents here. When you manage to die twice in the same franchise, that's a pretty embarrassing record to say the least. And there's only one thing left to say. Perez and Erickson, you guys f***ed up. Let's be real, they had Hoffman here, just about caught red-handed from the very beginning. After learning that the man who killed his sister was the only other victim besides Eddie who was cut with a serrated blade, that was your sign right there that Hoffman couldn't be trusted. They've been suspicious of him all along, and Perez clearly had a good feeling that he was really the one responsible, so why bring him to the lab at the most crucial moment where he could do something like this, without even bringing some more security along with you, or at least checking to see if he was armed? Bringing him in on the case just gives him more opportunities to deliberately sabotage things and make himself look innocent, or worse, take out the only people who know the truth while their guard is down. If they were even the tiny bit suspicious that he might be involved, then the better decision here would have been to leave him out of the loop until they had all of the facts, and keep a close eye on him in case he did anything fishy. If they'd all been tailing him like they should have, then they would have caught him in the act days ago, and this whole thing would have been over already. Somehow, they lost the 3-on-1 while Perez even had a gun, got themselves and an unsuspecting technician killed, and let the bad guy get away. That's what you call failing on every conceivable level. When you let the killer get the jump on you, even though you've had him dead to rights the entire time, Perez and Erickson, you f***ed up. William makes it to the final chamber just as the timer runs out. Looking around, he sees that he's locked in a caged room between Pamela on the one side and Tara and Brent on the other. It turns out that the reporter is his sister, but the others are the family of a man who he denied coverage to when he needed it the most, effectively sentencing him to death. And now it's time for him to finally answer for his crimes. A TV comes on in Tara and Brent's room with a message from John offering them the chance to decide if William lives or dies. The man and his sister beg them to spare his life, but Tara here isn't convinced. Stepping to the cage, she tells William that she isn't going to kill him for revenge. She's going to kill him so that he can never hurt another family ever again. As she puts her hand on the kill switch, Tara realizes that even after everything William has done, she still can't kill him, but her son says that he can. Stepping forward, Brent flips the switch. A contraption made out of dozens of needles swings down from the ceiling and injects William's body full of hydrofluoric acid, melting him from the inside out until he's finally cut completely in half. While Hoffman was away, Jill broke into his observation room to complete the final step of her husband's plan. The moment that he sits back down at his desk, she stuns him with an electrical device that's attached to his chair. With Hoffman unconscious, Jill straps him down to the chair and places Jigsaw's classic revenge bear trap device over his head. When he wakes up, Hoffman realizes that he only has 60 seconds left to live. Thinking quickly, he smashes the mask down onto his hand as hard as he can, breaking it enough to slip out of the restraints. Once he's free, he tries disabling the mask with a screwdriver, but it's no use. At the last second, he jams his face through the window on the door, using the bars to stop the trap from completely opening. Somehow, the plan works, and although he's been badly disfigured, it looks like Hoffman here has just passed his ultimate test. Saw 6. Cool, not that bad. Interesting traps. And hey, the legacy of Jigsaw lives on. But let us know down in the comments below what you would have done. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like and subscribe, and check out the How to Beat playlist for more videos just like this one. Oh yeah, and have a damn good day.